Hello everyone, hope everyone is doing well. Today we are going to talk about absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and gains from trade. We're going to understand absolute advantage and comparative advantage using a very simple model. And then we're using that model, we will see which direction does trade flow. And then finally, we're going to see how do countries gain from trade. So before we start, let us first, as I've said, we will be using a model to understand what is absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So for this, let's assume we have two countries. And so let's say we have USA and we have Canada. So USA has, and this is coming from the Productions Possibilities Frontier, which we have covered in a previous lecture. If you would like to review that, you can watch that video again. I will post the link below. So let's say USA can produce two goods. They are going to be either corn or car. Now, to produce corn, we need a technology or something to know like how much corn can the US produce in a given using the given resources. So let's say that US can produce 1 ton of corn is produced in 20 hours. And to make one car, the US needs 100 hours. So one car is produced in 100 hours. Canada can also produce two goods. So the two goods of Canada are, again, corn and cars. And in Canada, 1 ton of corn is produced in 50 hours, and 1 car is produced in 150 hours. So these are the two goods and their technology given to us. Now, we don't really need the hours available for work, hours available in each countries. Even without that, we can we can calculate the gains of trade, and we can look at which direction does trade flow. So let us first look at absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is basically the ability to produce a product using fewer resources. So in this case, if I look at corn, and if I'm comparing between US and Canada, I can see that US produces 1 ton of corn in 20 hours, but Canada needs more hours to produce the same amount of corn. And in parentheses, I'll write 50 hours. So in our case then US has an absolute advantage in corn. Similarly, if I look at cars, again, I can see US produces 1 car in 100 hours. Canada needs 150 hours. So in this case too, I can say that US has an absolute advantage in cars. So basically, if I look at both these products, I can see that US is actually, I'll write absolute advantage as AA in corn, and absolute advantage in cars. So US is actually good in producing both products. Now that is a problem with us in trade. Then if US can produce both goods using fewer resources, then through absolute advantage, we cannot understand why trade happens. So instead, we use the idea of comparative advantage to see why countries trade and how can they benefit from trade. So first, let's see what is comparative advantage. So if we define comparative advantage here is the ability to produce at a lower opportunity cost. So basically, in this case, what we will do is we will calculate the opportunity cost of US So we will find the opportunity cost of US, compare that opportunity cost with that in Canada. And then once we compare these two, from here we will understand which country has a comparative advantage in that product. So from here, what we can do is we can use some idea in order to, or we can use a method to kind of find out how to calculate opportunity cost. One way of doing it is drawing PPFs, then using them to find opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Now, we don't really need to draw PPFs here, but if that helps you, you can do that. Another way we can do it is, and I think it's a little simpler way, is basically take a round number. So let's say we have 100 hours here, we have 20 hours here for US. So let's say US has 200 hours to spare, okay? So in 200 hours, using 200 hours, US can either make, if it's making cars, US can either make 200 divided by 100, which is 2 cars, or if it made corn, US could make 200 divided by 20, which is 10 corn. So then from here, I can see that in the US, I can make either 2 cars or 10 corn. Now, if I simplify it, it is basically 1 car or 5 corn. So I just divided both sides by 2 and I get this. So this would be the opportunity cost of US. Now, if I'm doing the same thing for Canada, let's say Canada also has 200 hours wouldn't multiply it, so let's take 300 hours. Any multiple of these two numbers would do, and it doesn't have to be a number. If you're comfortable using decimals, you can use decimals. You can just put 200 hours there. But let's say Canada has 300 hours to spare. Now with 300 hours, how many cars could they make? Each car needs 150 hours, so 300 divided by 150 would be 2 cars. Now if each car needs 50 hours, or each ton of corn needs 50 hours to make, if you have 300 hours, then 50 would be 6, which would be 6 corn. So in Canada, let me actually write it nicer. So here we can see that US had 1 car or 5 corn. Now in Canada, it's going to be 2 cars or 6 corn. Or in other words, if I simplify it, divide both sides by 2, it would be 1 car or 3 corn. So let me write it up here now. So in this case, we have Canada can produce 1 car by giving up 3 tons of corn. US can produce 1 car by giving up 5 tons of corn. Now, if I were a buyer, if I am in the market to buy a car, and let's say corn is the currency, if I say that the quality is the same in both these places, and I'm looking to buy a car, and I will go for the cheapest car, basically, because it's the same car, whichever country can give me the cheapest price, I'll go there. So it seems like in Canada, I only need to spend 3 corn to buy 1 car, but in the US, I need to spend 5 corn to buy 1 car. So in this case, I would say Canada has a lower opportunity cost in cars. So Canada has it cheaper for cars. Now, what about corn? If I actually divide both sides, if I want to see what is the opportunity cost for corn, I could just do 1/3 car or 3/3 corn. So I just flipped the number. So 1 corn would be 1/3 of a car. So if I give up 1 corn, I get 1/3 of a car. In the US, it is going to be 1/5 of a car or 1 corn. So I divided both sides by 5. So 1/3 is 0.33. 1/5 is 0.2. So if I wanted to buy 1 corn, I give up fewer cars. So US would have a lower opportunity cost in cars. Or sorry, not cars, in corn. So this then gives us the idea of comparative advantage. So we can go here and write, since Canada has a lower opportunity cost in cars, we say that Canada has a comparative advantage in cars. On the other hand, US has a lower opportunity cost for corn. So we say that US has a comparative advantage in corn. So this then tells us, based on us, is that since Canada has a lower opportunity cost in cars and US has a lower opportunity cost in corn, so Canada should produce cars and then sell cars to the US. Since US has an opportunity cost in corn, so corn should be produced in US and sold to Canada. So this is what comparative advantage tells us, is that whichever country has a lower opportunity cost, that country should specialize or produce more, or we can say, use the word now, specialize, instead of saying produce. What specialize here means is that we produce more of or completely just produce one item. US, on the other hand, should produce more or specialize in corn and then sell it to Canada. Now, why is that the case? So let's look at an example. So here we have, now let's look at using PPF to try to understand why should the direction of trade be this way? Why should US produce corn and sell it to Canada, and Canada produce cars and sell it to the US? So for that, so we don't know the hours yet. So, the hours that we had was missing. So, but let us assume some hours, and any hours would do here. The hours could be equal, the hours could be different, but let's say that the US has 10,000 hours available. Okay, and let's say Canada has 6,000 hours available. Okay, so we have US with 10,000 hours, Canada with 6,000 hours. Well, Canada has fewer people than US, so that's why Canada has fewer hours available. So let's say this is going to be US PPF, and this is going to be Canada PPF. So let's put corn here and cars down here. Same thing, corn up here and cars down here. So we know that, let us get that information from above. We already know that these are the productions possibilities, or these are the technologies available for US and Canada. So I'm just going to copy and paste it down here so I don't have to scroll back and forth. So since 1 ton of corn requires 20 hours, I have 10,000 hours available. So if I use all my resources to produce corn, I would produce 10,000 divided by 20, which would be 500 tons of corn in the US. So let us add these numbers. So it's going to be 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. So one corn point should be here. Now the other one for cars, since US needs 100 hours to make one car, we have 10,000 hours available. So 10,000 divided by 100 should give us 100 cars. So let's write. So the other point will be down here. So my PPF will be that for the US. Now for Canada, since we have 6,000 hours available, now each ton of corn requires 50 hours to make. So 6,000 divided by 50 would be 120. So 1 point will be up here. Now for cars, we have one car requires 150 hours. So 6,000 divided by 150 would be 40. So we have 40 cars. And that's the other point. So my PPF will be the straight line. Now, just for our example's sake, let's say US is using half its resources to produce cars and half its resources to produce corn. And Canada is doing the same thing. So this is just as a starting point, let's say before trading started. So right now, let's say there is no trade. So under that point, under that scenario, let's say if US is using half the resource to produce corn, so then US will be producing 250 corn and 50 cars. So this will be the point of production. I know the lines are not really straight, but it should be a straight line. Canada is also using half its resources for corn, half its resources for cars. So basically 3,000 hours for corn and 3,000 hours for cars. And so if I find the point, it should be at 60 and 20. So it should be at this point. Now we found out that my PPF was, or my opportunity cost was, 1 car or 5 corn. And in Canada, the opportunity cost is 1 car or it was 3 corn. Okay. Now let's say right now the US and Canada figured out that they are next to each other. So they just found out that they're next to each other, so they don't need this border. And they can start trading against each other with each other. So let's say they find out, okay, well, this is my opportunity cost. If I can produce 1 car, 5 corn, but I can buy 1 car from you for 3 corns. So let's say that the US is like, let me buy the car from you and let me trade it with you at this rate at, let's say that, let me write it down here. So instead of 3, so somewhere in between. So instead of 5 and 3. So let's say US sells. So US sends over 40 tons of corn to Canada. And in return, because 1 car is equal to 4 corns, and in return receives 10 cars from Canada. Now let's add a couple of new terms here. So instead of saying sends over, whenever a country sells products to another country, we will call this, instead of sends over, we will call this export. So instead of writing sends over, we will write export. And in receive, if it buys products from another country, we will say imports. So similarly, if I use the same terms in terms of by looking at the from Canada's angle, I would say Canada exports cars to the US and imports corn from the US. So whenever a country sells something abroad, we say the country exported that product. And if they're buying something from abroad, we say they are importing it from abroad. So let's look at this. So initially, my production was in the US at 250 corn and 50 cars. Now I sold 40 corn to Canada. So 40 corn means I produced 250, but I sold 40. So now I am at this point, which is 210. Now I used to have 50 cars, but now I got 10 extra cars from Canada. So right now I have 60 cars. Now is this point, where is this point going to be? So let's look at, if supposing US wanted to produce this combination in the US, how many hours would it take? So we know that 1 ton of corn requires 20 hours. So I could write 210 times 20 plus 1 car is produced in 100 hours. So, and I'm producing 60 cars times 100. This number would be 60 times 100 is 6,000. 210 times 20 is 4,200. So it actually comes out to be 10,200. So this line, if you remember from PPF drawing, this line was actually constructed using 10,000 hours. So this point that we have just created is going to be outside the PPF. So let me actually erase this and make it a little nicer so that it's not. So it should be. Now, same thing with Canada. Canada received 40 tons of wheat from the US. So from 60, they will go to 100. And they sold 10 cars And so they are left with 10 cars at home. Now, where is this point going to be? We can again calculate that. So 1 ton of corn requires 50 hours. So if Canada produced 100 corns and 10 cars, it would be 100 times, we need 50 hours to make 1 ton in Canada, plus 10 cars times 150. So that would be 5,000 plus 150. So it should be 6,500 hours, which is more than 6,000 hours that we have. So this point should also be outside the PPF. So if we look at this, this is our production line, and this is our consumption point. Same thing with Canada. This is our production line. This is our production point, and this is my consumption point. So even though I'm able to produce on the line, I'm producing at an efficient point, I'm able to consume at a point that is outside of the production possibilities frontier for both US and Canada. So if we produce at our opportunity cost and then trade based on whether the opportunity cost is lower in the country, that country exports that good, and the other country where the opportunity cost is higher is importing that good, then we are able to consume at a point that is outside of our production's possibilities frontier. If you remember from before, we couldn't do this because if we were not trading with other countries, because we did not have the resources to produce at a point outside of the production's possibilities frontier. So this is telling us that if we follow producing at a lower opportunity cost and then trading based on that, then we are actually able to consume at a point that is outside of our production's possibilities frontier. So this gives us then the ability to lead a higher standard of living. So then we can say from here, trade based on comparative advantage allows us to consume at a point that is outside the PPF. Now, one question that may be, why it was this chosen? Why not any other point? So let's say we say that, what if we chose 1 car was traded for 2 corn? So basically, US is offering, I'm going to sell you 1 car, or I'm going to buy 1 car from you, but I'm only going to give you 2 corn. Okay. So in that case, the US will see that, would that be beneficial for the US or Canada? Canada is like, if I sell 1 car, Canada is actually giving up 3 corn to build 1 car. Now, if US is only offering 2 corn for that, Canada is actually losing money in that case. So Canada will not want this price. Similarly, if Canada's like, okay, what if you actually offered 1 car for a higher price, for like 6 corn? So for 6 corn, then the US will be like, well, I could produce 1 car for 5 corn. Why do I need to buy a car from you for 6 corn? So I'm not going to trade at that term. So the only trading that can happen is if the price of 1 car is between 3 to 5 corn. That's when the trade will be advantageous to both countries. So hopefully this was beneficial for you about learning about absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and why do we trade using comparative advantage, and how do we get gain from trade by trading using comparative advantage. I will see you at a later lecture, and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.